The polished marble floors of the Ethelgard Foundation's grand lobby reflected a cold, indifferent sky, mirroring the state of Julian Croft's soul. From his penthouse office on the 80th floor, he could orchestrate miracles. With a flick of his pen, he could fund a pediatric wing in Nairobi, endow a university chair in quantum physics, or save 1 million acres of Amazonian rainforest. His name was a monument to modern philanthropy, a global synonym for benevolent power. But the grand gestures felt hollow. The press releases like eulogies for a feeling he no longer possessed. The foundation, the magnum opus he had built with his late wife, Elara, had become a pristine, sterile mausoleum to her memory. It was her passion, her belief in small, tangible acts of kindness that had been the seed. Now it was a corporate behemoth, and he, its master, was a stranger within its walls. A series of anonymous, vaguely worded complaints had reached his private desk, bypassing the usual corporate filters. Whispers of payroll irregularities and a culture of fear within the Foundation's own service staff. It was a dissonant note in the carefully composed symphony of his public image. It was an insult to Elara's legacy. She had always said, "Julian, a house is only as strong as its foundation, and a foundation is only as good as how it treats the people who sweep its floors." He had let the floors get dirty. And so, Julian Croft, the titan of industry, had ceased to exist. In his place was Arthur Finch, a retired history professor with a convincing limp cultivated from a forgotten ski injury, a tweed jacket that smelled faintly of mothballs, and the weary, watery eyes of a man for whom the world had become a series of small disappointments. For 3 weeks, Arthur had haunted the Utopia, the Foundation's exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant on the mezzanine level. He was a ghost at the feast, a creature of quiet habit. The same corner table with a clear view of the entire dining room, the same order of black coffee that he nursed for 2 hours, the same meticulous, unseen observation. He was watching an ecosystem, a miniature kingdom with its own brutal politics. He saw the wealthy patrons, insulated by their privilege, dissecting stocks and gossiping about scandals, utterly oblivious to the silent anxieties of those serving them. He saw the intricate, desperate dance of the servers, a choreography of forced smiles and tightly controlled movements, and among them he saw her, Elena. She wasn't the youngest or the one who received the most brazenly flirtatious compliments from the businessmen. There was a quiet dignity about her, a resilience that seemed etched into the very lines of her posture. She moved with a weary grace, her shoulders carrying an invisible weight that seemed heavier than any tray of food. Faint, spidery lines of exhaustion radiated from the corners of her eyes, a testament to sleepless nights and unrelenting stress. Yet her hands were a surgeon's as she placed a cup of coffee before him, creating not a single ripple. Her smile was a small, fragile thing, but it was genuine, a flicker of warmth in the refrigerated air of manufactured luxury. On the lapel of her starched, ill-fitting uniform, she wore a small, tarnished silver pin in the shape of a swallow. It was old, the details softened with age, a tiny, defiant emblem of flight in a gilded cage. Julian, in his guise as Arthur, began to piece together her life from overheard whispers and her own guarded, professional small talk. He learned her mother was fighting a losing battle with a degenerative illness, the medical bills a rising tide threatening to drown her family. Her younger brother, Leo, was a bright kid studying engineering at a community college, his tuition a constant, looming specter. Elena was the bulkhead holding back the flood, working double shifts, her life a relentless, exhausting cycle of balancing plates and balancing budgets that never, ever balanced. He saw her once on her break, huddled in a corner of the service hallway, phone pressed to her ear, her voice a low, pleading murmur. "I understand the policy," she was saying, "but the copay just went up again. No, there's no one else you can talk to. It's just me." She hung up, and for a moment, her professional mask crumbled, revealing a face of such profound despair, it felt like a physical blow. Then she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked back into the dining room, her smile firmly back in place. She was, Julian realized, with a pang of cold, unfamiliar shame, completely invisible to the world he had built to help people. The architect of this gilded misery, the petty king of this small kingdom, was Marcus Thorne, the restaurant's general manager. Marcus was a man sculpted from avarice and cheap cologne. His suits were a size too tight. His handshake was always vaguely damp, and his smile was an oily veneer that never reached his small, predatory eyes. He was a master of duality. To the patrons, he was a fawning sycophant, his voice a river of honeyed compliments. "An exquisite choice, Mr. Henderson. The sommelier will be thrilled." To his staff, behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, he was a tyrant. Julian watched him. He saw him publicly berate a young busboy, Carlos, for a misplaced fork, his voice a low, venomous whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. He saw the boy's eyes well with tears of humiliation. He saw Marcus accidentally spill a drop of red wine on a hostess's pristine white blouse, his hand lingering on her arm for a moment too long, his apology laced with a suggestive smirk. Julian saw him on the phone in his glass-walled office, laughing uproariously while Elena was pleading with the insurance company. He was a black hole of empathy, sucking the light and warmth from everyone around him. The corruption was systemic. 1,000 tiny cuts designed to bleed the life and hope out of his employees. Julian, with his decades of experience in corporate finance, saw the signs everywhere. He watched Marcus handle the cash tips, his thick fingers moving with the practiced ease of a casino cheat, palming a portion of the bills before they were officially pooled. He overheard conversations about payroll discrepancies, about accidental clock-out errors that consistently shaved precious minutes, then hours, off the paychecks of people who counted every single dime. It was a quiet, relentless campaign of theft, conducted with the smug certainty of a man who believed himself to be above consequence. The irony was a physical sickness in Julian's throat. Here, in the Ethelgard Foundation, a place that spent $500 million a year fighting global poverty, the staff were being systematically impoverished. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, the restaurant was unusually quiet. The hushed ambiance was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. A young waitress named Chloe, barely 20, her face a constellation of nervous freckles, had dropped a tray of champagne flutes. The crash was like a gunshot. Marcus materialized from his office, his face a mask of purple fury. He didn't yell. That was not his style. He preferred the slow, meticulous dissection of a person's self-worth. He cornered Chloe by the service station, his bulky frame trapping her against the wall. He spoke in a low, venomous whisper, his words for her alone, but his posture a chilling performance for the rest of the staff, who froze in place, pretending to polish cutlery or fold napkins. He didn't attack her for the mistake. He attacked her for her very existence. He called her clumsy, incompetent, a liability, questioning how someone so useless could even manage to dress herself in the morning. Elena moved instantly. She crossed the dining room, her expression calm but firm. She placed a comforting hand on Chloe's trembling arm, positioning herself slightly between the girl and Marcus, a quiet shield. It was an accident, Marcus. The floor is slick from the rain. I'll help her clean it up. We can add it to the breakage log. Marcus turned his reptilian gaze on Elena. His lips curled into a sneer. The breakage log is already full of this one's mistakes. You can clean it up from her final paycheck if she ever breathes too loudly again. Are we clear? Elena's jaw tightened, a flicker of defiance in her eyes, but she simply nodded, her focus on the weeping girl. crystal clear, Marcus. It was in that moment, seeing Elena stand as a lone bastion of human decency in his corrupt little kingdom, that Julian knew. The anonymous reports were not exaggerations. They were the timid, desperate cries of people trapped in an abusive system he had created and then ignored. The rot wasn't just in the finances, it was in the soul of the place. He had to know how deep it went. He decided it was time to push, to create a crack in the facade. The next evening, a busy Thursday, he was deliberately difficult. As Arthur, he became the customer every server dreads. He sent back his steak, claiming the medium rare was closer to medium. He complained that his water, glistening with ice, wasn't cold enough. He questioned the vintage of the wine. He was the caricature of a cantankerous, entitled old man, testing the very limits of Elena's professionalism. She absorbed it all with that same unwavering, weary grace. She apologized profusely, even when it wasn't her fault. She rectified every complaint with a quiet efficiency. She never once let her polite mask slip, but her eyes, when she thought he wasn't looking, held a deep, profound sadness. He wasn't just another difficult customer to her. He was a reflection of the world she inhabited, a world that demanded her endless servitude and offered only criticism in return. Finally, he asked for the check. The total was $94.50. He placed a crisp $100 bill in the leather folio. When Elena returned with his change, he did something that felt physically repellent. He carefully picked out a single $5 bill and left it on the tray. He left the coins. It was an insult so blatant, so personal, it couldn't be ignored. Elena came to clear the table. Her eyes flickered to the paltry tip, and for a single, unguarded heartbeat, her mask of professionalism shattered. A wave of raw, unfiltered hurt washed over her face, so potent it was almost visible. It was the look of a person who had worked a 10-hour shift on her feet, absorbed insults, catered to whims, and was rewarded with a gesture that told her she was worth less than nothing. She recovered in an instant, her features smoothing back into a neutral calm. But Julian had seen it. He had inflicted the wound himself, and the knowledge was a bitter acid in his gut. This was the moment of truth. Would she say something? Would she slam the tray down? Would she simply accept the humiliation and walk away, another scar on her spirit? She did none of those things. She gathered the bill and the receipt, her movements precise, almost robotic. But as she turned to leave, her hand, hidden from the rest of the room by her body, brushed his. The contact was brief, electric. With a movement so deft it was almost imperceptible, She slipped a tiny, tightly folded piece of napkin into his palm. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and in them he saw not just desperation, but a desperate, calculated gamble. It was a plea, a challenge, and a cry for help, all in one. He waited, his heart hammering against his ribs, until he was in the sound-proofed silence of his limousine, the city lights a blur of indifferent colors. His hands, which had signed 9-figure acquisition deals without a tremor, shook slightly as he unfolded the flimsy piece of paper. On it, in tiny, cramped, but meticulously clear handwriting, were just 3 words and a number. Invoice 743. The Lamb. The next morning, Julian Croft, dressed in a suit that cost more than Elena's monthly rent, walked into the office of David Chen. Chen, his head of security, was the only person on Earth who knew about the Arthur Finch experiment. A former FBI special agent who specialized in white-collar crime, David was a man who moved with a quiet, coiled efficiency, his mind a steel trap for details. He was Julian's operational right hand, the only person he trusted implicitly. "Shut the door, David," Julian said. His voice had lost its usual boardroom authority. It was the voice of a man who had looked into a dark corner of his own creation and been horrified by what he saw. He placed the small, crumpled napkin on the center of David's immaculate, polished desk. David picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it were a piece of evidence. He read the words, and a single eyebrow arched in curiosity. "The Lamb? Sounds biblical." "It feels biblical," Julian replied, sinking into the plush leather chair opposite the desk. "It feels like a plague is descending on my house, David. A plague of greed and cruelty. I want to know what Invoice 743 is. I want to know everything it touches. And I don't want to see it from a spreadsheet. I want you to go in there. I want you to smell the fear. I want you to find the source of this rot." David leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You want me to go undercover? In the kitchen? I want you to become a ghost, just like me," Julian confirmed, his eyes hard. "But a ghost who can open locked doors and read encrypted files, get a job as a dishwasher, a busboy, a prep cook. I don't care. The paper trail is one thing. I need the human truth. I need to know who is suffering, and I need to know who is responsible. Burn this place to the ground, David," figuratively speaking. Within 48 hours, David Chen, the man who had overseen security for G8 summits and personally vetted every member of the Ethelgard board, ceased to exist. In his place was David Park, a recent immigrant with a deliberately spotty work history, a quiet demeanor, and a desperate need for a job that didn't ask too many questions. He was hired as a kitchen porter. His domain became the steamy, clattering, high-pressure hell of the dish pit, a place Marcus Thorne rarely ventured. It was the perfect listening post, a nerve center of gossip and grievance. While David immersed himself in the underbelly of utopia, Julian began his own assault from the stratosphere. With a single encrypted phone call to his chief technology officer, he had the Foundation's entire digital accounting system, including all of its restaurant-related subsidiaries, mirrored to a secure, air-gapped server in his penthouse. He sat before a bank of monitors, the glittering city lights below forgotten, and began to pull on the fragile thread of Invoice 743. At first glance, it was unremarkable. It was an order for 24 racks of premium, pasture-raised, imported New Zealand lamb, a specialty dish on the Utopia menu, priced at a staggering $120 a plate. The invoice cost was astronomical, nearly $8,000. It was signed off by Marcus Thorne and co-approved by a mid-level accountant in the Foundation's finance department named Gerald Stiles. Everything appeared to be in order. The supplier's manifest matched. The inventory logs showed the lamb was received. The point-of-sale system showed the dishes were sold. On paper, it was a perfect, closed loop. But Elena's note wasn't about paper. It was a warning that the paper was a lie. Julian kept digging, fueled by black coffee and a cold, simmering rage. He started pulling every invoice co-signed by the Thorne-Stiles pairing. A pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, then glaring. Groceries, liquor, cleaning supplies, linens, all from a small, rotating handful of boutique, high-priced vendors he'd never heard of. The costs were consistently 20 to 30% higher than industry standards. He did a quick cross-reference. The Ethelgard Foundation, a registered nonprofit, was paying more for its cabbages and its toilet paper than the Four Seasons Hotel. The vendors were ghost companies. A deeper dive revealed they were all LLCs, registered to the same P.O. box in Delaware, with shell directors leading back to one man, Marcus Thorne's brother-in-law. It was a classic kickback scheme, elegant in its simplicity. They were bleeding the Foundation dry, one overpriced case of lamb at a time. Meanwhile, in the trenches, David was piecing together the human cost of this elaborate fraud. The kitchen was a pressure cooker of resentment and fear. He learned from Miguel, the grizzled, world-weary head chef, that the premium lamb was, in fact, a much cheaper domestic product, delivered in unmarked boxes. The supplier, owned by Marcus's relative, would deliver the cheap meat while invoicing for the expensive import. Thorne and Stiles would approve the inflated invoice. The supplier would kick back 50% of the massive profit margin to them, and they would split it. It was simple, brutal, and incredibly lucrative. But the financial fraud was only the beginning. David, with his quiet demeanor and willingness to do the dirtiest jobs without complaint, became a trusted confidant. He listened as the staff talked in hushed, angry tones during their smoke breaks in the grimy back alley. He heard how Marcus forced them to buy their own uniforms, deducting the exorbitant cost from their already meager paychecks. He learned about the breakage fee, a slush fund Marcus maintained by docking the wages of the entire waitstaff for any broken dish, regardless of who was at fault. The fund was supposed to cover replacements, but David saw Marcus use the cash from it to buy a new gold watch, which he then wore to work the next day. He spoke to Chloe, the young waitress Marcus had humiliated. In a halting, tearful voice, she told him that Marcus had offered to forget her mistake and restore her shifts if she'd join him for a private drink at his apartment after work. She had refused, horrified. Her hours had been cut in half the following week. It was predatory, despicable extortion. The most insidious scheme of all was the tip skimming on credit card tips, which made up the vast majority of their income. Marcus would shave 15% off the top for a vaguely defined administrative and credit card processing fee before pooling the rest. The industry standard was 2 to 3%. That extra 12% was a phantom tax that went directly into his pocket. Julian did the math. Based on the restaurant's volume, Marcus Thorne was personally stealing nearly $100,000 a year from the lowest paid, most vulnerable employees in his building. David captured it all. Using a micro recorder disguised as a pen, he taped conversations. He took photos of the fraudulent delivery manifests with a burner phone before they were shredded. He documented the fear, the tears, the quiet, simmering rage of decent people being pushed to the brink by a petty tyrant. The investigation revealed that the rot extended beyond Marcus. His accomplice, Gerald Stiles, wasn't just a random accountant. He was the nephew of a long-standing, powerful member of the Ethelgard Foundation's board of directors. This changed everything. It was no longer a simple case of employee fraud. It was a political minefield. Exposing Stiles meant risking a public scandal that could tarnish the Foundation's name, Ilara's name, and threaten its fundraising for years to come. Julian faced a choice: handle it quietly to protect the institution, or detonate the bomb and let the shrapnel fall where it may, in the name of true justice. The memory of Ilara's disappointed face in his dreams made the choice for him. One evening, David found Elena in the cramped, windowless break room, rubbing her temples, her face pale with exhaustion. On the small table next to her was a stack of pink and white envelopes overdue medical bills for her mother. She was staring at them, her expression one of utter, soul-crushing defeat. On her uniform, the little silver swallow seemed to mock her, a symbol of a freedom she would never have. David sat down opposite her. "Tough day," he said quietly, in his guise as the unassuming kitchen porter. Elena jumped, startled. She quickly swept the bills into her bag. "They're all tough days. He's a piece of work, isn't he?" "Marcus," David said, his voice low. Her eyes darted to the door, a flicker of pure panic in them. "Don't. You're new. You don't know. Don't talk like that. He has ears everywhere." "Sometimes," David said, his voice steady, holding her gaze, "you have to talk. Sometimes silence is how they win." He leaned forward slightly. "Thank you for the note about the lamb." It was the thread we needed to start unraveling his whole sweater. Elena's face went white. She stared at him, her breath catching in her throat as comprehension dawned. She saw past the stained uniform and the weary demeanor of the kitchen porter. In his steady, intelligent eyes, she saw an ally. Tears welled, not of sadness, but of a terrifying, fragile hope. "You're not... Who are you?" she whispered. "I'm a friend of the man in the corner table," David said simply. "And he is very, very angry." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. The dam of her composure finally broke. "There's more," she whispered, her voice trembling with the risk she was taking. "There's a ledger. A little black book. He's arrogant. He writes everything down. The kickbacks, the tip skimming, who he pays off in accounting. It's his insurance policy. He keeps it in the safe in his office." David nodded slowly. This was the smoking gun. Getting into that safe is difficult. "I know when it's open," Elena said, her voice gaining a new, hard strength. The fear was still there, but it was being eclipsed by a resolve that had been building for years. Every Friday night, right after close, he meets with the liquor distributor. They settle up in cash, off the books. For 10 minutes, while he counts the money, that safe is open. This was the final piece, the physical proof, the key to not just firing Marcus Thorne, but to burying him in a mountain of litigation. David relayed the information to Julian. The plan was set. It would not be a quiet firing. It would not be a discreet resignation with a severance package. Julian wanted a reckoning. He wanted a public crucifixion of the greed that had festered in the heart of his life's work. The stage would be the Foundation's annual donor gala, an opulent affair held right there in the Utopia restaurant, a week from Friday. It would be Marcus Thorne's greatest triumph, and his final act. The night of the gala, the restaurant was transformed into a glittering paradise. The air hummed with the self-congratulatory conversations of the city's elite, the clinking of baccarat crystal, the soft, elegant strains of a string quartet, men in bespoke tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns moved through the room, their laughter echoing off the marble walls. They were celebrating a year of the Æthelgard Foundation's good work, blissfully unaware of the swamp of corruption and despair just beneath the polished surface. Marcus Thorne was in his element. He glided through the crowd, a king in his court, his greasy smile fixed in place, his pockets already heavy with the cash from his meeting with the liquor distributor. He felt powerful, admired, untouchable. Across the room, at his usual corner table, sat Arthur Finch. He looked even more out of place than usual tonight, a shabby gray moth among butterflies of wealth. He had been allowed in only because the staff, under strict orders from Marcus to humor the crazy old coot, knew him as a harmless, if eccentric, regular. Elena was on duty, her face a pale, determined mask. She moved through the room with a focused, almost brittle intensity. Her hands steady, her eyes darting occasionally to Arthur, then to the grand clock on the wall. In the kitchen, David was a silent presence, coordinating via a hidden earpiece with a two-person team from the district attorney's office's Public Integrity Unit, who were posed as auxiliary event staff, waiting for his signal. The moment came just as the main course was being served. As Marcus was schmoozing a table of potential seven-figure donors, Arthur Finch raised a weak, trembling hand to summon him. Marcus excused himself and swaggered over, his expression one of pure, unadulterated annoyance. Dealing with this pathetic old man on his most important night of the year was an infuriating distraction. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Yes," Arthur said, his voice frail, but carrying a strange clarity. "My steak. You see, I believe I ordered the New Zealand lamb, but this tastes rather domestic, and the portion seems significantly smaller than what the price on the menu would suggest." Marcus's smile tightened into a rictus grin. It was a direct surgical strike. He glanced around, seeing a few of the nearby donors looking over with mild curiosity. He had to shut this down, quickly and brutally. "Sir," Marcus began, leaning in close, his voice a low hiss of menace, his breath smelling of stale champagne. "You are a guest here tonight, a guest we have tolerated. I am willing to overlook your age-related confusion, but I suggest you finish your meal and leave quietly. This is not the kind of establishment for people like you." "People like me?" Arthur asked, his voice gaining a strange new resonance that made the hairs on Marcus's arms stand up. "You mean people who notice when they're being cheated?" The color drained from Marcus's face. The blood pounded in his ears. This was no confused old man. This was a threat. His arrogance, his hubris, and his panic converged into a single, fatal error. He decided to make a public example of him. "You know what?" Marcus said, his voice suddenly loud, a booming, theatrical performance for the entire room. "You're right. You deserve a refund for your troubles." He reached into his trouser pocket, his hand bypassing the thick wad of illicit cash and coming out with a fistful of loose change quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies. And then he did it. With a flourish of ultimate contempt, he threw the coins onto the floor in front of Arthur. They scattered across the marble with a series of sharp, ugly clatters that cut through the music and the chatter like a blade. The entire restaurant fell dead silent. "There," Marcus spat, his face flushed with a petty, triumphant rage. "There's your money. Now get out of my restaurant before I have security throw you out." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, and absolute. Every eye in the room was on the old man and the scattered, glinting coins at his feet. Julian looked down at the silver, a pathetic constellation of disrespect. This was the sum of it all. This was the ultimate expression of the contempt the powerful held for the powerless. A man's dignity, a restaurant's integrity, his wife's entire philosophy, all tossed on the floor like trash. But it was Elena who moved. With the eyes of 100 of the city's most powerful people on her, she walked from the service station, her steps measured and deliberate. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't look at the stunned patrons. Her gaze was fixed on the old man, Arthur Finch. Then she knelt. It was not an act of subservience. It was an act of profound, solemn grace. One by one, her fingers moving with unshakable purpose, she began to pick up the coins. When she had gathered every last one, she stood up. She held the coins in her cupped hands as if they were a sacred, terrible offering. She walked not to Arthur, but to Marcus, stopping directly in front of him until he was forced to meet her gaze. The entire room held its breath. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear, and it was devastating. It carried the weight of 1,000 indignities, 1,000 stolen tips, 1,000 silent tears. It was the voice of every person he had ever cheated, threatened, or humiliated. You think this is what we're worth, Marcus? She said, her voice ringing in the profound silence. A handful of change? You steal our tips. You skim from our paychecks. You force us to pay for our own uniforms. You take food from our families' mouths. And you think you can buy our silence with this? She held out the coins. This isn't just money. This is the truth. It's the truth of invoice 743 and the cheap lamb you sold them for a fortune. It's the truth of the fake breakage fees and the ghost vendors. It's the truth of the little black book you keep in your safe. Marcus's face had turned the color of ash. He stared at her, speechless, his bravado crumbling into raw, animal panic. Elena then turned her blazing gaze to Arthur. "And you, sir," she said, her voice filled not with malice, but with a righteous, heartbreaking fire. "You saw it. You've been sitting here for weeks. You saw all of it. The cruelty, the theft, the fear. You saw it, and you did nothing." Julian Croft let the silence hang for one moment longer. He let her accusation, so true and so false, settle over the room. Then he rose from his chair. And as he rose, Arthur Finch, the frail professor, vanished. He straightened his back, and the years, the stoop, the frailty melted away. He stood to his full height, and the aura of command that radiated from him was as unmistakable and as terrifying as a bolt of lightning. He looked directly at Marcus Thorne, and for the first time, Marcus saw the man behind the disguise. He saw the cold, blue fire of absolute power in the billionaire's eyes, and in that instant, his world ended. "You are right, Elena." Julian's voice boomed through the hall, a voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms and swaying global markets. "I saw everything. And you are wrong. I did not do nothing." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards the kitchen doors. They swung open. David Chen stepped out, no longer in his porter's uniform, but in a sharp, dark suit. In his hand, he held a small, black, leather-bound ledger. Flanking him were two uniformed police officers and the two plain-clothed event staff, who now held up the gleaming gold badges of the district attorney's office. "Marcus Thorne," one of the detectives said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and extortion." As they cuffed a babbling, protesting Marcus, the other detective walked over to a pale, sweating Gerald Stiles at a donor's table. "Mr. Stiles? We have a warrant for your arrest as well. You might want to call your uncle on the board. This is going to be a long night." The room erupted in a cacophony of gasps, frantic whispers, and the clicking of cell phone cameras. Julian Croft stood in the center of it all, a silent, avenging God in his own defiled temple. He walked over to Elena, who stood frozen, the coins still clutched in her hand, her face a mask of shock and dawning realization. He gently took her hands and turned them over, letting the coins fall onto a nearby table with a soft jingle. "This," he said, his voice now quiet, for her alone, "is worthless." He then reached out and gently touched the small, polished swallow on her lapel. "This, however, this is priceless. It's the spirit of this foundation, a spirit that I allowed to become lost, a spirit you never forgot." He then turned to address the entire shell-shocked room, his voice ringing with renewed purpose. "Tonight, you came to celebrate the work of the Ethelgard Foundation. Instead, you have been shown a profound failure. My failure. A system that allows the vulnerable to be exploited under the very roof dedicated to protecting them is not a system worth preserving. It is a system that must be torn down and rebuilt. And that rebuilding," he said, his eyes finding Elena's again, "starts now." In the weeks that followed, the Utopia restaurant was closed. A full forensic audit of the entire foundation was launched, and the subsequent media firestorm was brutal, but cleansing. Gerald Stiles' uncle was forced to resign from the board in disgrace. Marcus Thorne and his accomplice, facing a mountain of evidence, took plea bargains that included significant prison time and full financial restitution. Julian, true to his word, rebuilt from the ground up. An entirely new employee Bill of Rights was drafted for all his enterprises, guaranteeing living wages, fully transparent tipping policies, and a robust, independently managed, anonymous channel for reporting abuse. He summoned Elena to his penthouse office. She walked in nervously, wearing a simple dress, looking overwhelmed by the panoramic view of the city. He didn't ask her to sit. He walked with her to the vast window. "Elara, my wife," he said softly. She believed that the world is changed not by grand pronouncements, but by the accumulation of small, courageous acts of decency, by people who refuse to look away. When you knelt to pick up those coins, you weren't just picking up change. You were holding a mirror up in Mepe to this entire foundation. You showed me what we had lost. He then offered her the position he had created specifically for her. She was to be the first director of the new Ethelgard Employee Advocacy and Welfare Program, endowed with an initial $10 million. Her job would not be in this office. Her job was to travel to every hospital, research center, and charity his foundation funded, not to speak to the directors in their plush offices, but to the janitors, the cafeteria workers, the security guards, and the administrative assistants. Her mission was to find the other Elenas, the other ghosts in the machine, and to ensure their voices were not just heard, but amplified into action. On her first day, in a new, bright office of her own choosing on a lower, more accessible floor, she found a small, velvet box on her desk. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was her silver swallow pin. It had been professionally restored, its tarnished surface polished to a brilliant shine, its lines sharp and clear, its wings seeming to lift in perpetual flight. Tucked beside it was a handwritten note from Julian Croft. It read, "Thank you for reminding me that true wealth isn't about what you can give away, but about the dignity you refuse to let be taken. Now, go teach them how to fly."